right. Sorry to look at my fingers. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining Tipping Point, Connecticut's first affordable housing conference series. My name is Kylie Goslin. I'm the executive director of the Partnership for Strong Communities. And throughout the week, the partnership is hosting over 30 different sessions featuring local, state, and national experts, leading conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues in our state. You can join the conversation about Tipping Point on Twitter using our hashtag Tipping Point 2020, and you can follow us at PSC Housing if you aren't already. This session is entitled Connecticut's Eviction Crisis, COVID-19, and Interventions. And just so you know, for today's presentation, ASL interpretation is available. In order to view the ASL interpreter, please pin the video of Marissa Rivera in the participant panel. She'll be interpreting for us during the session today. That information is also in the chat. We will move through a couple housekeeping items and then I'll turn things over to our panelists. First, I just want to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority and the Melville Charitable Trust. Their deep support has allowed this conference series to exist, and they have always supported us. So thank you to both of them. And thank you to our collaborating sponsor, the Connecticut Department of Housing, and to our supporting sponsors, Housing Enterprises, Inc. and Whittlesey. A couple other items for you to be aware of as we move through this session. The session is being recorded. We're going to make all recordings available to conference attendees as soon as possible. And all participants have entered muted. Please remain on mute throughout the session unless a presenter has asked you to unmute. And finally, if you have a technology issue, please select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send it in the chat to myself or to just note for tech support, and we will try to work through that issue with you during the session. The presenters are going to let you know how they would like their content questions to be submitted throughout the session. So with that, I will turn it over to today's panelists to introduce themselves to you and share some great information. Thank you for joining us all today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. I'm going to share my screen with our presentation. And so I'm just going to do a quick intro of all of us. My name is Melissa Marichal, and I'm a staff attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. And joining me are Shaznene Hussain, is also a member of the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, as well as Ashley Blount, who's a community organizer with CTCORE, Organize Now, and Cancel Rent, and Lizzie Rosenthal, who is Deputy Director of New Haven Legal Assistance Association. So we're going to be presenting throughout this hour, and so I'll also have them introduce themselves individually. But first off, I just wanted to give everyone an idea of the order of items that we're going to be discussing. I'm going to start off with just an overview of evictions in Connecticut and what that looked like before the pandemic. We're then going to speak on the work of our 3 organizations right now and what we're all doing. And then we'll open it up to questions and additional discussion. And so to ground this conversation, we wanted to briefly talk about the consequences of eviction and why we think that eviction is something that is very important for our communities and something that you should care about too. And up at the top is a quote by Matthew Desmond, a sociologist who wrote a book a few years ago that brought shown a lot of light to this cause. And in that book, he says that eviction is a cause, not just a condition of poverty. And so his book, along with a growing body of research, is showing that eviction drives socioeconomic consequences, including those that we see up on this slide. So eviction is associated with higher rates of emergency room visits in the years after eviction. It's associated with suicide and depression in the years after eviction. It's associated with academic loss on the part of children that are in the households that lose their homes through eviction. It's even associated with additional economic instability because of the costs that are associated with sometimes paying the court costs that a landlord charges a tenant, all the way through repurchasing lost items through the eviction, and even losing jobs after the eviction process due to the instability that the eviction causes in one's life. There's also the additional issue of eviction records, which is something at the Fair Housing Center we've been looking at increasingly because it can cause issues even just at the moment of an eviction's filing, because landlords tend to not want to rent to a tenant who has any sort of eviction record, even if it's for something at like a lapse of time or when a lease has expired and a tenant is maybe looking for a new place but hasn't found one yet. That type of eviction can hurt someone because it's on their record, and it might make it harder to find new housing. In turn, that means that often individuals that have eviction records are forced to select housing that is not of their preference and is often in less high quality apartment buildings, which then of course further entrenches disparities in health consequences, since we know that housing is a health issue and that rates of lead poisoning and rates of asthma are associated with poor housing and are associated in our state with where our communities of color are living and in our biggest cities. So when we're thinking about eviction, we have to think about it as a driver of inequality and a driver of outcomes for health, education, wealth building. And that's why we think it's so important to start this discussion during this conference and continue this conversation as we move through this pandemic. And to give you guys a sense of the renter market, this is a breakdown of renter households by race and ethnicity in Connecticut. And as you can see, while less than a quarter of white households rent their homes in Connecticut, a majority of people of color, a majority of Black households and Latinx households, Indigenous households are renting their homes in Connecticut. And when we're looking at just the population of renters in Connecticut, we're also seeing that renters that are Black, Hispanic, or Latinx, they are also carrying higher cost burdens in comparison to white renters. So prior to the pandemic, data was showing that they also are more likely to be cost burden. Obviously, this is something that is a topic of much discussion during an affordable housing conference. So when we're thinking about affordability and the tenants who are most at risk for being close to at risk of eviction, it's a disproportionate impact on Black and Latinx households who are already rent burdened, and small changes in income, missed working hours could make that difference for them. And when we're looking at evictions prior to the pandemic, we know that last year there were over 19,000 evictions filed in the state of Connecticut. We also know that Bridgeport, Waterbury, Hartford, and New Haven had some of the highest numbers, both in the state of Connecticut, but also in comparison to other cities in the United States. And this picture to the left shows a visual representation of those 19,000 plus cases last year. And as you can see, it does reflect that there's clustering in our biggest cities, in Hartford, in New Haven, in Waterbury, in Bridgeport. And so this is what eviction was looking like last year. And we also know from data now that Black and Latinx renters and women renters were more likely to have evictions filed against them in comparison to other renters. And so when we think about how COVID-19 impacts this landscape, there's a lot of different ways we can think about it. The maybe first one that comes to mind is the most basic when we think about a health emergency, and that's how many cases of COVID are we seeing? And as has been much talked about since March and April, the rates continue to be much higher for Black and Latinx households. And we're also seeing that the number of households that are behind on rent right now is also higher for Black and Latinx households. And so when we put those two and two together, of course, we are expecting to see an increase in evictions. Right now, as we'll talk about in later slides, but also as the moratorium protections wind down, and that this is an issue of racial justice because of our landscape, because of the history of racial discrimination in our state and segregation in our state that has resulted in such large inequalities and disparate outcomes. So I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague Shaznene, who's going to talk a little bit about those existing eviction protections that I just mentioned.
Great.
Shaznene?
Great. Thank you, Melissa. I hope you can hear me. Okay. All right. Thank you. So given all of the data and systemic issues that Melissa just took us through. Oh, sorry, I should introduce myself. I'm Shaznene Hussain. I work as a community educator and a tenant organizer at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. So given what Melissa just took us through in terms of what eviction rates looked like prior to the pandemic, and then looking at both the racial and socioeconomic disparities associated with evictions, I would like to take the next few minutes to go through some of the protections that have been put in place in Connecticut at this time to try and mitigate some of the sort of worst impacts of the pandemic in relation to evictions and housing stability, but also to take us through some of the systemic challenges that continue to impact renters that we speak with on a daily basis, and to just sort of underscore that there is still, despite these protections, there is still a real struggle for many residents of Connecticut. So I'll provide a very brief overview of the eviction moratoriums and the rental assistance programs that are available in Connecticut, and then go through some of the systemic issues that these protections are trying to address, and also some of the continuing challenges that we see. So right now, we have 2 eviction moratoriums in place in Connecticut. One is a state eviction moratorium, and the second one is, in fact, a federal eviction moratorium. The state eviction moratorium was put in place by the governor starting on April 10th and has subsequently been extended and is now in place through December 31st of this year. This means that landlords cannot file most new eviction cases until January 1st of next year. There are some important exceptions to this moratorium. There are 4 types of exceptions, including an exception on against filing new eviction cases for any rent that was due on or before February 29th, basically the onset of the pandemic in Connecticut. There is also an exception against filing new eviction cases if a tenant owes 6 or more months of rent that was due on or after March 1st. And these exceptions are important to note because we'll see in a second, because these exceptions have contributed to a rising rate of new eviction cases filed over the last 2 months. At the federal level, the CDC issued a moratorium on evictions starting September 4th that extends through December 31st of this year as well. This particular eviction moratorium is available to eligible tenants who have lost income or have had expensive out-of-pocket medical bills. Unlike the state moratorium, however, this one is not put in place automatically, meaning tenants are not protected automatically from a case being filed against them. Instead, eligible tenants must read the CDC issued declaration, make sure that they are in fact eligible and the information that they're signing on to is accurate, and then sign and give this declaration to their landlords. For existing eviction cases that are being processed in Connecticut courts right now, the courts are scheduling hearings regarding the declarations in cases where there has already been a judgment against a tenant and where the tenant might be closer to an eviction. If the CDC declaration applies, or at least the court will determine if the CDC declaration is valid and can apply to prevent the tenant from actually being removed from their housing during the pandemic, or at least until December 31st at this time. Through all this, it is important to note that rent is still due and tenants are expected to pay as much of their rent as possible on time. So if we could go to the next slide, Melissa. Thank you. So given the fact that the courts, there is some room now for new eviction cases to be filed, the courts are holding remote mediations, hearings, and trials in a number of cases at this time. They resumed hearing these cases at the beginning of September. So right now, these remote mediations, hearings, and trials are in cases that are either exempt from the state moratorium or in cases that were filed before the moratorium began on April 10th. And the courts are also currently issuing something called default judgments, which is a ruling that the tenant automatically loses their eviction case if they fail to file a required form or to attend a court event such as a mediation or a hearing. The courts are also issuing executions, and these are orders that permit a state marshal to physically remove a tenant and their family from their home. So in existing cases and in new cases where the statewide moratorium does not apply, we are seeing courts process and go ahead with eviction cases. And these are some of the numbers that this is just to illustrate sort of the degree of the challenge or the systemic challenge with evictions that we are facing right now, even during a pandemic. This data is collected from publicly available court records and show us that since Governor Lamont declared a public health emergency on March 10th of this year, landlords have filed over 2,000 new eviction cases, and landlords have also filed well over 1,000 motions for default judgments against tenants who may have not responded to court documents in time. And since September 1st, since the courts have started processing eviction cases again, the courts have issued 255 executions. These are the orders that permit a state marshal to remove a tenant and their family from their home. And an additional 246 execution requests are pending. This means that landlords have filed for the ability to have the tenants removed from their housing. And also currently we see that landlords are filing more than 100 eviction cases per week. This is the highest weekly rate that we've seen since March of this year. And I would like to note that this is happening while these 2 eviction moratoriums are in place. And so even if these moratoriums are extended at the end of this year, if the current rate of eviction cases persists, we are looking at thousands of cases in the coming year, thousands of eviction cases in the coming year, and likely well over the 2019 numbers. And we can go to the next slide, Melissa. So in an effort to, as I mentioned in the previous section, rent is still due. So despite the moratoriums, tenants are still expected to pay rent, or as much of the rent as they can at this time. However, we know that given the high rates of unemployment and underemployment during the pandemic, we hear from renters every day who have lost work or lost income due to the pandemic. So we have advocated for, and the state has put in place, temporary rental assistance programs, and the 2 main statewide programs are listed here. The temporary rental housing assistance program is available to any qualifying Connecticut residents. They can apply online, which is currently recommended, or they can call the phone number listed on this slide as well. Low and moderate income households are prioritized for this assistance, especially if they have lost income due to COVID-19. There is a limit of $4,000 of assistance per household, and this any rental assistance that the tenant qualifies for is paid directly to the landlord on behalf of the tenant. So this is not money that goes to the tenant, it goes directly to the landlord. When the tenant applies, they're expected to provide a social security number, their 2019 income, and their currently monthly income as well. It is important to note if a tenant believes that they were denied assistance but do in fact qualify, they may appeal the assistance program's decision or the denial of assistance as well. In the most recent phase of the rental assistance program, the Department of Housing has also created a portal for landlords to apply, and landlords can apply for up to 10 of their tenants, for rental assistance for up to 10 of their tenants. There is also a smaller amount of rental assistance available for undocumented migrants, and they can access this assistance by calling the number listed here or contacting CIRI Connecticut via email. CIRI is an organization that works with migrants, including undocumented migrants here in Connecticut. If renters are not sure how to access any of these programs or would like more information about any of them, they can also call 211, and they can also check to see if there are any other assistance programs available through their city or through local organizations as well. The rental assistance, there are several challenges with the rental assistance programs, and in particular with those 2 programs, it is important to note that there have been several challenges, particularly for undocumented migrants in accessing rental assistance, and data also show, this is important to acknowledge given that data also shows that undocumented migrants are some of the worst impacted groups as a result of income loss and job loss during the pandemic as well. Broadly speaking, we've noted several systemic challenges, especially with phase 1 of the rental assistance programs that have been put in place in Connecticut. For instance, the time between an application's pre-approval and the disbursement of funds can take several months, and this is several months over which a tenant is uncertain about whether they will be able to access funding and be able to keep their housing. While applications are being processed, landlords may proceed with an eviction case not covered by the state moratorium, especially right now if the tenant owes 6 or more months of rent since March 1st. The limit of $4,000 per household has also led some landlords to refuse to participate when the tenant owes more than $4,000. And in many cases, given Connecticut's average rent amount, this is $4,000 is not very much. And so there are many tenants who are finding that they cannot make use of these funds because landlords have refused to participate, given that the tenant owes more than the maximum amount of funding that is available per household. The rental assistance program is, given the current numbers, will assist only about 10,000 households if every household that applies receives the full $4,000 as well. What we are finding also is that throughout the state, many tenants are still not aware of either of these programs, the statewide rental assistance program and the one for the undocumented migrants. The eligibility requirements have also discouraged many tenants who in fact do qualify from applying. And we have also noted some accessibility barriers for people with limited English proficiency and for people with either visual or hearing impairments as well. So these are very important systemic challenges that we would like to raise awareness about and to hopefully address as well. And then finally, I just want to end here before Lizzie Rosenthal speaks about some of the work that the legal assistance programs have been doing. I would like to just speak about the interventions that the Connecticut Fair Housing Center has been making in the past few months. We have primarily, our work around evictions and eviction prevention has primarily focused on assisting pro se tenants or tenants who do not have legal representation in eviction cases. And addressing systemic problems to do with the eviction process. So we have gathered information about state and federal protections, interpreted what these protections mean, and then challenges that tenants are facing, sometimes even in accessing these protections. We have also distributed information about the eviction process itself, the moratoriums and rental assistance programs to tenants, as we are finding that information about these programs and moratoriums are really not as widely distributed as, well, ideally should be more widely distributed. Also providing legal advice to, we have provided some legal advice to tenants at risk of eviction and at risk of removal from their homes, and also supporting tenant organizing through work with organizations like CTCORE and Cancel Rent, and all of the coalition organizations that are part of Cancel Rent. And finally, we have been advocating strongly for state action that addresses some of these systemic problems related to eviction, especially during the pandemic. So I will let Lizzie address some of the work that the New Haven Legal Assistance Association has been doing, as well as some of the challenges that they've seen in assisting tenants.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lizzie Rosenthal. I'm the Deputy Director at New Haven Legal Assistance Association. I've been there since 2017, and I spent 11 years prior to that at Legal Aid in Chicago doing housing work. And I continue to represent clients in housing cases in New Haven. And I'm going to slow down a little bit because I realize that the ASL interpreter probably needs me to, but I'm also mindful of the time. I want to make sure that we have some time for Ashley and some time for questions as well. So New Haven Legal Assistance Association represents low-income people throughout New Haven County and including the lower Naugatuck Valley. And so that is where we focus our work. We share a lot of our work with Greater Hartford Legal Aid, which covers the Greater Hartford region, and Connecticut Legal Services, which really covers pretty much the rest of the state. So we work very closely in coordination with them on a number of these issues, as well as organizations like Connecticut Fair Housing Center. I think that a point that I wanted to make, I think that Shaznene raised that I want to reiterate, is evictions are happening now. The eviction crisis has started. The governor did put a moratorium into place in April, and the courts did on their own stop executions and stop processing eviction cases from the period between April and September. but they are now processing cases again. And as Shaznene said, there have been several hundred executions issued, evictions orders issued since September. There have been default judgments. There were 800. I just want to remind people that between the time that the governor declared the public health emergency and the time that the courts stopped processing cases and the eviction moratorium started, there were close to 800 cases filed. And as Shaznene said, there are cases, hundreds of cases being filed every week now that meet one of the governor's exceptions to the current moratorium. So it's happening now, which is particularly troubling since our numbers are creeping up. And there'll be a number of executions that will be allowed to be issued at the beginning of the new year if no moratorium is extended or if nothing is done with regard to those particular cases, as well as the cases that have been subject to the current moratorium that could be filed potentially starting in the first week of January. So it's happening now, and it's going to come in waves. And it's something to consider as our numbers in Connecticut and across the country are creeping up. Shaznene did talk about the fact that the court is processing cases right now. We've been seeing as attorneys, as advocates, we've been seeing issues with people getting notices from the court that are not written for really lay people. They're not written to the education level that a lot of people who receive court notices need them to be written. So they're confused about what they're being told to do. There are a lot of people who don't have internet. All court is being done online right now, at least for eviction cases. Court is being done entirely online. And it's difficult to access these hearings even from a smartphone. And many of the people who are in eviction court don't have computers with cameras, don't have reliable internet access, and so are having to participate in these hearings by telephone, meaning that they can't see the judge, they can't see the attorney for the landlord. If the landlord's participating, they can't see the landlord. May mean that if there's documents that the attorney is showing on the computer, like you see here right now, the person on the phone can't see them. So we're seeing a lot of issues like that. The way that we at Legal Assistance at New Haven Legal Assistance have been trying to address this is by trying to reach out to everyone who currently has a hearing. And we've been able to do that with the help of organizers who've been on our staff. And I think there's also been some coordination with Cancel Rent to reach out to people directly saying, hey, did you know you have this hearing? And it's shocking how often people don't even know that there was a hearing pending. So we haven't been able to go in and search the data to see how many people have missed hearings that just didn't know about them, but we are trying to reach out prospectively to people and represent them in court, which is significant. It's a significant response on our part because we have 4 or 5 attorneys total who are doing this work right now. We have never been able to provide what's considered universal representation to tenants. Tenants in eviction court, about anywhere between 70 and 90% of tenants in eviction court traditionally have been pro se because legal aid programs just do not have the resources to represent all the people who need help. And we've always had to make difficult choices in triaging our intake. But we recognize what's going on and we recognize the effect that it's having on low-income people. And we've been really trying to reach out to as many people as we can possibly reach and helping them in court. And I don't have fancy data for you, but I think we are making a difference for folks. We have been able to help people understand the CDC declaration, which I do want to talk about in a minute, helping them access it and making use of it if they do qualify and it's available to them. Identifying problems with the underlying eviction case and perhaps getting it resolved because we've identified a subject matter jurisdiction issue or recognize that the landlord has done something to undermine the eviction case in such a way that it means that the tenant can work something out, or possibly, helping them understand the TRAP program and how they need to apply and helping them navigate that process. So I think that there's some good. It's definitely been difficult. It's been a lot of work on the part of the attorneys and the our intake coordinators who are helping us open these cases, as well as our organizers who've been pounding the pavement to reach out to folks to help them. Shaznene talked a little bit about this CDC declaration. It's been a huge, it hasn't been as helpful to tenants as we would have hoped when it first came out. The order is confusing. I think attorneys across the nation have spent countless hours trying to understand it. So you can imagine what it might be like for a tenant to understand what it means and how they might be able to use it. It requires affirmative action on the tenant's part to access the form, fill it out properly, and give it to their landlord. And the declaration itself, which a tenant is signing under penalty of perjury, has a lot of pitfalls and can be quite scary and concerning potentially to a tenant that they're being told they're signing something under penalty of perjury. And Melissa has put up on the screen for everyone to see what the declaration looks like. And the tenant essentially has to use this form in this way in order to access the protections of the CDC declaration. There's no requirement that the landlord advise them about their rights to potentially file a CDC declaration. And in fact, and I got this information from CT Fair Housing, there was a survey done of 185 landlords who manage over 26,000 rental units. And on average, they were receiving fewer than one CDC declaration per building that they manage. So I think that tenants probably don't know about the declaration. They may well be scared to fill it out on their own because it says penalties of perjury on it. And it's very confusing to understand how you meet it. We are also seeing when we have not been able to represent people and they've gone in front of judges on their own without an attorney, there's a lot of nuance to these different factors that the tenant has declared that they qualify for, that the judge is questioning them about and making nuanced determinations about whether or not the tenant qualifies for the protections of the CDC declaration. And tenants who are not necessarily trained in the nuances of what it might mean to use best efforts to obtain all available government assistance for rent or housing, or may not understand how to explain the nuances of why they've been unable to pay their full rent due to a substantial loss of household income, or may not be able to explain the nuances of how they've been using best efforts to make partial payments, taking into account other non-discretionary expenses. We're finding that tenants on their own are really not able to access the protections of the CDC declaration, and that where we are able to discuss with the tenant ahead of time, talk through what the different factors are, what their situation is, we are able to determine whether or not they qualify for the declaration, and we are able to effectively advocate with the court for those protections. But frankly, those protections, if the tenant can even access them, are only through the end of the year. And so in some, I think Shaznene and Melissa touched on this a little bit. We need something more. We need more rental assistance. We need some legislative intervention to deal with masking or expunging eviction records for people who've had evictions during this time, because as Shaznene discussed at length in the beginning, that scarlet E, that eviction on your record means you'll have a lot of trouble accessing quality, affordable housing in the future. And so we need both funding and legislative interventions to protect our most vulnerable residents in the state. I'm going to pass it on to Ashley now to talk about what Cancel Rent has been doing.
Thank you. And I just want to make an offering since we're all here together. Folks, if you would like, I invite you to please turn on your screens. As an organizer, this has been a very interesting time for me to be a participant in many Zoom calls when I'm very accustomed to and used to and love to be around people and see people and connect one-on-one, face-to-face, and to be able to interact with others. Oh, that is so beautiful. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I really, really do. Okay, now let's get to it while I'm here. So my name is Ashley Blount. I currently serve as Deputy Director of CTCORE and one of the community organizers that works along with Cancel Rent Connecticut. We are a coalition of community organizers, tenants, landlords who have come together to demand for the state to cancel rent. This group has been together since April. So we have been in quite a fight together. This is the first time for me as an organizer to be working alongside folks in legal aid, which if anyone knows anything about lawyers and organizers, we deserve a hand clap. However, we all know what is at stake right now. We have listened to Melissa, to Shaznene, to Elizabeth, Lizzie, tell us like what is happening in the state in real numbers. This is real. We've been in shutdown since March. We've been in a global pandemic for the last 9 months. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives due to COVID-19. We just, I can't even say we finished. We are still in the process of an anxiety-filled election. And let's just think about that. And think about all the folks that we just numbered, the thousands of residents in Connecticut who are at risk of eviction or who are already going through the process of eviction during a global pandemic. It is November 16th, 2020, and COVID-19 is on the rise. And here we are speaking of folks who are at risk of losing their homes. Your home is your safety net. It's now a student's learning space. It's your private space. It's where we grow and love and we be with folks who we deeply care about. And folks are losing their home in the middle of a global pandemic. That is the space and the intention in which Cancel Rent, this coalition, has been moving through organizing. This is my first time working in housing as an organizer. So all this legal jargon, all the legalese, all this stuff, I am just learning. However, my experience has taught me enough where I know facing eviction and going through this process can be stressful, can be shameful, it can shift your life. And I'm gonna add this with no shame. And imagine folks who are going through that now during a global pandemic. It's quite a bit. So from Cancel Rent's approach, we are working to build power. That looks like connecting tenants to resources to avoid eviction, all the resources that Melissa, Shaz, and Lizzie spoke about, the declaration, the CDC moratorium, understanding the eviction process. We're also informing community, those like yourself, about this upcoming and certainly current eviction crisis. You've seen the numbers before COVID-19. We were in a crisis before the shutdown. Now there are going to be evictions at a critical mass. So this is also part of the organizing, joining these calls. We're also mobilizing residents to press elected officials to address the potential housing, well, the current housing crisis. Because I'm not sure if you have seen anything, but I haven't seen any reports, any news clippings of any elected official speaking directly to the housing crisis that is currently happening in the state of Connecticut on November 16, 2020. This crisis is happening and no one is speaking about it. When the federal government is just moving along, putting folks in office, and did not provide another stimulus check. With that, with building this power, because the power is important, we center the tenants. Outreach is done with intention for all the reasons that I explained, that this is a very sensitive topic. It's very fragile and it's a fragile time. Canvassing is key to organizing, but people are key to the movement. So when we go to those doors, when we make those phone calls, we meet folks where they are at. And sometimes that means maybe they close the door the first time. Sometimes that means maybe walking around to the back and waiting for somebody to open the door so you can get in the building. That means ensuring that we have PPE, we have masks, we have hand sanitizer. We ring the bell and we go down a few stairs to make sure we make that space. It means really organizing and moving through this campaign with intention, knowing that we are here for our community. So the demand has always been to cancel rent. It's been the same demand since April to cancel rent. We are one of the most wealthiest states in this country. And we have 4 cities on the top 10 eviction list, on the top 100 eviction list. To me, that's wild. That doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not sure if that makes sense to you. I mean, yeah, you can say for a myriad of reasons, but morally, that doesn't make any sense. Shaznene, Melissa, and Elizabeth have gone through the limited rental resources in the state, which do not cover all folks that are at risk. The new the new Connecticut moratorium that was signed by Governor Blount does not cover folks who owe more than 6 months of back rent. We've been in shutdown for 9 months. And I'm sure the number is climbing, but last time I checked, over 750,000 Connecticut residents filed for unemployment. And there are businesses that have shut down. So that means people are not going back to work right away, which means they cannot pay their rent. This is not a story of people don't want to pay their rent. This is not a story of people want, PS5. It's not having a PS5. It's having a room, a place, electricity in which I can plug in a PS5. If we go to the next slide. So here's my call to action. We need help. Cancel Rent needs help. As you see, there are thousands of folks who are at risk of eviction. There are folks who have already gone through the process. So we need folks to come out, to canvass, to make phone calls, to answer emails, to create your own email and send out to folks about cancel rent, to spread the news about cancel rent on social media, to reach out to your elected officials, even by a phone call or email, or shouting them out on social media, to say, hey, what do you think about this cancel rent? We're also calling for folks to table. Because we are in COVID-19, we're still doing things outdoors. Because we are in a global pandemic, there is a lot more foot traffic at food pantries. So that is a space where we have been tabling. This also is a time for the organizations represented in this call to maybe set up some rental relief. If you are part of a religious affiliation, a religious organization, your church, start a rental relief. You got a book club, start a rental relief. As you can see, there are thousands of folks that are in need. All it takes is one step. The government has showed us all we got is each other. We can go to the next one. So We will continue to work together with folks during this crisis through building people power, uplifting tenant voices, and pushing for real rent relief. We will work against the system of injustice. Cancel rent sounds, can sound far-fetched. It sounds far-fetched to a lot of people. However, I want us to think about what happens if we do not cancel rent. What will happen to the thousands of families? And those are so that's one person that's represented in those numbers that Shaznene gave us. That's one person, that's head of household that's represented. So imagine for each one of those 1,000 plus folks that Shaznene told us, let's count it's 4. So we're talking over 4,000 folks or more, because math, not strong suit, who are going to be evicted and then have eviction on their record. So not only do I not have a home, it's going to be nearly impossible for me to find new housing. And due to COVID, the CDC moratorium tells us it's not safe for us to now be with family. I can't now go move back in with grandmom or mom, or my cousin can't take me and my family in anymore because it also puts them at risk. We are in unprecedented times where we can't even count on our family to take us in because it's a safety risk. There has to be more. It's not okay for us to let this go by and none of our elected officials speak about this. It's not okay for the state of Connecticut to open up a rental assistance program and only 2 folks receive assistance. It's not okay for a new rental assistance program to be in place and it's so many barriers and you have to wait so many months before you're able to get help. It is not enough. So we are calling for every person on this call to tell someone about Cancel Rent, to like Cancel Rent on Facebook, to share the Cancel Rent information on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. We're calling you to reach out to your elected officials. We're calling for you to reach out to the housing commissioner in your local city, the state. Somebody help us. We're really at the point where something has to give. So the link is at the bottom of this page here if you would like to volunteer or if you would like more information, please visit us on Facebook. And I'm going to hand it over. I think this is going to go back to you, Melissa or Elizabeth.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ashley. I'm just going to jump on over to the contact info. Ashley mentioned Cancel Rent on Facebook and the website to sign up to volunteer, and our contact information is on this slide as well. And if there's any questions in the chat box, I think we have just a few minutes.
There was a question from Daria Keys. Since the moratorium will be up at the end of December, all the back rent, late fees, and interest will be due January 1st. What needs to happen at the state and federal level to prevent a surge of evictions? Rent is due now, so it's not merely that it will accrue on January 1st, but you are correct that landlords can start, unless moratoria are extended, landlords can certainly start taking more action after the new year. And I think Greg, Melissa and Shaznene's colleague at the Fair Housing Center answered it pretty well in the chat that unfortunately, it seems unlikely that additional federal assistance is coming, which is shameful, quite frankly. Connecticut must extend the moratorium for the duration of the public health emergency and ensure that rental assistance is prospective, keeping people in their homes, while creating programs and incentives for landlords to forgive and to liquidate rental arrearages to the landlords to keep everyone safe and in their homes. And I think that pretty much covers it. I don't know if there's anything that anyone else would want to add to that.
This is Shaznene. To Lizzie, to build on that and to also reiterate something that both Melissa and Ashley mentioned, and Greg points to here as well, which is even if we have rental assistance going forward, and even if we extend, a little bit, extend the moratoriums for a little bit longer, right now there are hundreds of tenants, perhaps thousands, who already owe a significant amount of rent, and they have lost income, they have lost jobs. We're looking at not only a possible eviction record, impeding their ability to find stable and decent housing, but also trying to do so with an enormous amount of debt, possibly going into next year. So that's, so I just want to point to Greg's comment about rental assistance being prospective, but also some effort to help with rental, with debt that tenants are going to be taking on with rent they already owe, and fees and fines that they will owe once the moratoriums expire.
So I think that we get cut off right at 2:30. So I guess we'll end here, but thank you so much for joining us in this conversation, and please be in touch. We need everyone's help in order to confront what we're facing right now. So thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.